Hey, you all, bonus episode today. We are introducing the Winter Growers podcast with host Clara Coleman. There are 3 episodes up right now, so if you search your favorite podcasting app for the Winter Growers podcast, or just cruise over to no-tillgrowers.com, you can listen to over 3 hours of winter production talk and nerdiness with several more on the way. Clara has done an amazing job, and we are absolutely honored that she got into this project with us. I'm going to share one of the first 3 episodes with you today on this feed, but the rest, like I said, will be live on the Winter Growers podcast feed, so make sure to subscribe to that. All 3 of the first episodes that are up are really exceptional. There is Liz Grasnick from Missouri, and she and Clara chat about all sorts of stuff, from working with a soil consultant to proper winter infrastructure. There's another episode up with Brian Bates of Bear Creek Organic Farm, and they talk about employee management and microgreens and just so much more. These episodes are absolutely packed with info. The episode of Clara's podcast that I wanted to share with you all was the one with one of my favorite farmers to watch, Cheyenne Sundance of Sundance Harvest Farm in Canada. I chose this of the 3 because, well, I've been wanting to get Cheyenne on the podcast herself for a while, but also because I just love this episode and what Cheyenne is up to. She and Clara talk about winter farming, obviously why Cheyenne is moving away from salanova in the winter, interplanting, and about Cheyenne's work fighting for racial justice in the food and farming world. So excellent and an important episode all around. One note before the episode starts is that Cheyenne's audio gets a little muddy at times, so if you miss something, let me know, and I can ask Cheyenne about it in the fall when I get her on the No-Till Market Garden podcast for a full interview about no-till stuff. All right. With that, take it away, Clara.
Hey, No-Till podcast listeners. My name is Clara Coleman at 4 Season Farm, and I'm hosting a new Winter Growers segment to talk about all things 4 Season farming. Growing up watching my dad trying to figure out 4 season growing on the coast of Maine, I know firsthand what a challenging endeavor it is, and with many different approaches. I'm excited to be interviewing some excellent farmers located around the country, some well known to the farming world and others new to the scene. We talk about why they got into winter growing, their specific experiences and lessons learned, the advantages and challenges to year-round growing, and what they've discovered works for their bodies, families, and society. So let's dig in, and thanks for listening. Today's episode of the Winter Growers podcast is brought to you by Tunnel Vision Hoops. Tunnel Vision Hoops designs and manufactures do-it-yourself high tunnels, hoop houses, and greenhouses. With an extensive array of products to help large and small growers become more productive, they have 11 different tunnel widths to fit any application and designs to stand up to weather conditions from coast to coast. Tunnel Vision is also a national distributor of parts and accessories needed to build, maintain, or upgrade an existing tunnel or hoop house. Check out their Tunnel Vision Hoops YouTube channel for instructional how-to videos to help build a great high tunnel or hoop house. Here at 4 Season Farm, we have 2 movable high tunnels made by Tunnel Vision Hoops, and they are definitely my favorites. To learn more, visit their website at tunnelvisionhoops.com. Today's show is also brought to you by Growing for Market magazine. Which crops will pay back your investment in a hoop house or greenhouse? How does managing a greenhouse through the winter differ from summer growing? And which crops can just be overwintered in the field? Learn all that and more by subscribing to Growing for Market magazine. The writers are farmers, not journalists. They won't tell you how to grow, they'll tell you how they grow, so you can decide what works for your farm. Growing for Market is celebrating 30 years of helping local food and flower growers succeed with articles written by experienced farmers from around North America. Since 1992, Growing for Market is by farmers, for farmers. Plus, subscriptions start at only $30 per year. Whether you do farmers markets, local wholesaling, a CSA, or dream of starting a farm, check them out today at growingformarket.com. Request a free sample print or digital copy from their website, and podcast listeners can get a new subscriber discount of 25% off with the code WINTER when subscribing at growingformarket.com. I think Growing for Market magazine is an excellent and affordable resource for any grower. Welcome to the Winter Growers podcast. Today, my guest is Cheyenne Sundance of Sundance Harvest in Toronto, Ontario, Canada. At only 22 years old, Cheyenne started Sundance Harvest, a year-round urban farm, in September of 2019, first using only half a greenhouse. And since then, she's quickly grown to a third of an acre urban farm using 2 greenhouses and 10,000 square feet of outdoor land. Her winter crops include salanova, kale, collards, chard, herbs, microgreens, mushrooms from October to February. And then she transitions to hot crops such as cucumbers, peppers, and tomatoes, along with using interplanting techniques. She sells at a year-round farmer's market and an online farm store. As a farm that is rooted in food justice and eradicating systemic racism in the food system, Cheyenne founded a free educational program called Growing in the Margins for low-income youth who are part of marginalized groups such as BIPOC, LGBTQ2S+, and youth with disabilities. Cheyenne has a great Instagram presence with lots of educational videos where she shares her farming journey with followers. She's also one of the first recipients of Real Farmer Care, and I was very inspired by how much she's accomplished so quickly as a young farmer. And I loved her self-care activity of taking a weekend with friends to go tobogganing. So welcome to the show, Cheyenne. I'm so excited to have you here.
Hi, thanks for having me. I'm very excited to be here.
Great. So how are you? How has this year treated you with the pandemic, with having to pivot your business? How are things gone for you?
I feel like the word pivot is the best way to describe how my year has gone. I was a farmer's market farm through and through. I was expanding with the idea to do 2 farmer's markets, but the lockdown has hit Toronto twice, so there's really been no farmer's market activities here. So I feel like my year has been so-so. Financially, it's been all right, which I'm pretty surprised about. But of course, it could have been way better.
Yeah, I know we've all had to jump through a lot of hoops this year. So what about just, your mental health and self-care, since obviously that's something that's so important for farmers? How has that been for you?
It's been really good. I've actually taken up the initiative to start journaling every day. So I often journal what crops I'm growing, how I feel about them. And I'm really excited about this month's journal because I decided that I won't be growing any salanova anymore in the winter.
Wow. Okay, great. I'd love, what one of the great things about following your journey on Instagram is you are so open and transparent about the things you're trying and, then the things that you decide you don't want to do. And I love hearing that story because I'd be interested to find out exactly why.
Yeah.
Well, good. Well, to get started, I'd love for you to talk about your farming story a little bit, sort of how you got into farming, what inspired you, how all of Sundance Harvest sort of came to be.
Yeah, so I started farming in a pretty unconventional way. Once I left high school, I decided that I didn't really want to stay in the small suburb of Etobicoke in Ontario. I decided that I wanted to travel a bit. So I went to Cuba, I went to Montana, I went to Idaho, I went to BC, I went to Alberta, I went to a bunch of different places. And eventually I liked Cuba the best. And I had a few friends living in Vinales, Cuba, a small area in Cuba nearby Havana that is mainly grown with tobacco. But their farm had no tobacco on it, which made it really interesting compared to all the other farms nearby. They had lots of cavassa root, lots of collard greens, callaloo, and a lot of mango and banana trees. And they weren't really farming for profit, so I wouldn't say I got most of my business sense and my crop planning from them. Instead, they were farming, and they had a really interesting bartering and trading model with the community nearby. So let's say they had a bushel of bananas, they would trade that for a bushel of mangoes. And seeing how they had ran their farm with community in mind was really interesting, and I learned a lot about intersectionality and food justice from my friends in Cuba. After a couple months, I ended up leaving, and I went to a few different places, and I saw agriculture done in BC and ecological farming done in Quebec or Manitoba. And from my different experiences with working on farms and seeing how farms are run, I eventually came back to Toronto in about 2018, and I started looking for jobs within urban agriculture. I wanted to live in the city because I had some friends here, my family was here, so I really wanted to see if I could make an urban farm work on the scale I wanted it to be. I couldn't find any jobs within agriculture, even rurally outside of Toronto, or urban agriculture, because I was primarily focused on working at a workplace that cared about food justice, cared about equity, but also representation in agriculture. It was really important for me to invest in my next career as a farmer in a way that I felt was respectful to me and my community. So because I couldn't find myself reflected in agriculture at any farms I wanted to work at, I started my own farm. And so I started Sundance Harvest in September of 2019, and I think this was probably the best decision I've ever made.
That's great. Well, you're 23 now, is that correct?
Yeah, I'm 23 now, yes.
So that's amazing what you've accomplished in such a short time, especially with farming and traveling to Cuba too. I've always wanted to go there and look at their systems. So that's wonderful that you got an opportunity to do that. So that you started the farm in 2019, and how did all those pieces come together? Like, how were you able to find a greenhouse and, doing a business plan? How did all those steps work for you?
Yeah, so I didn't have anyone to mentor me or really anyone to look at as a blueprint, because here in Toronto and Ontario as a whole, there's very little BIPOC farmers, and BIPOC means Black, Indigenous, persons of color. And despite Black and Indigenous people in Canada being the people who are at most systemically oppressed in the food and land system, we aren't at all reflected in agriculture. So I kind of went in blindfolded almost. Like, I didn't know what to do, what I should do as a farm or even as a business. So I ended up actually seeing a greenhouse in Downsview Park, which is a large park north of Toronto, that was empty. I was hanging out in Downsview with some friends one day, and I saw this greenhouse, and I was like, I'm going to peek inside and see what's in it, because I'm kind of curious. And it was empty. It just had 2 golf carts in it. And I said, well, why are there golf carts in the middle of winter when food can be growing here? So I reached out to the folks who were responsible for the lease of the greenhouse, and they said that I could lease it. So it kind of just started from there, and I think it really started that way because I asked. I think a lot about farming is relationships, so asking and getting to know people, and the fact that I just asked and it was on the market then was a really good sign. So then I got that greenhouse. I got half to start with because, keep in mind, I never ran a farm before. I never managed a farm. I had very little experience farming in the traditional sense. I did read a lot of books, but I didn't have that hands-on experience. So in September 2019, I started with half of a greenhouse, about 800 to 900 square feet, so really, really small, but it turned out to be a success. I actually grew 50 pounds of tomatoes a week in that space. So having that many tomatoes and growing tens and tens of salad greens, bags, was really beneficial for me to see that, hey, Sundance Harvest can actually work. So in September of 2020, I got the full greenhouse, and then in December of 2020, I got a second greenhouse and 10,000 square feet of land. But currently, I do pay a lease on both of my greenhouses, and I pay rent on the land. It is pretty high because we're in Toronto, so the Toronto rental prices are through the roof, but I'm blessed that my farm can make it work.
That's amazing. And to be able to, more than double your growing within just over a year is incredible. But you've had lots of success with selling your crops, right? Where do you sell through?
Yeah, I would say the easiest thing I can do with my farm is sell the crop. I usually sell it in 2 days on my online farm store. I sell to Deaf and Grow Farmers Market, which is a really amazing year-round farmers market here in Toronto in the West End. And then I also sell on my new farm store. I've pivoted into the e-commerce side of farming at the middle of the COVID, so I would say it was around summer, because I noticed that if I was going to expand to a second greenhouse, I really should find another distribution method. So I have an online farm store, and then I'm currently doing the Different Growth Farmers Market.
And you can sell all of that within no time, right? You don't have anything left over.
Oh yeah, it's extremely rare. I can sell probably with these two methods of my farm store and Different Grove. I anticipate with having 2 greenhouses and 10,000 square feet of land, I'll have no issue selling. Usually people are always asking for extra greens. I feel like there's a very nice following with Sundance Harvest, probably because of the community work I do that I always appreciate. But I am very lucky that there's a demand for urban farmed produce here in Toronto.
Yeah. And it's great too because you're so active on social media, and I feel like that just dovetails so nicely with your farm to be able to, communicate to followers what you have to offer and to help educate them. So it's such a great combination in the way that you're using it. So I'd love to get a little bit more into, the crops that you're doing and sort of kind of the winter growing techniques that you've done. Since you started in September of 2019, did you start with cold hardy crops into that winter? Was that sort of your first approach?
Yeah, so my first approach, I can say humbly, was not what it should have been. I mainly focused on baby greens because I was a bit in over my head starting a business, and I was a bit nervous about taking any big leaps of growing kale or chard to college because they were longer season crops. What I didn't know was that you have to actually have longer season crops matured before the daylight hours dwindle. So I just ended up planting beds of baby salad greens and having them take 2 to 3 weeks to be ready for the next cut. So I mainly did that, and I didn't focus so much on cold hardy crops. It wasn't until January of this year that I really started to hone in and understand winter growing.
That's great. So it was just really kind of trial and error, and you were messing around with different things. And sometimes that's the best way to learn, really, especially because you get to see specifically what works in your region and your latitude. For instance, so you're at the 43rd parallel and zone 6B. So that's actually quite similar to me here at Four Season Farm. So you have a lot of similar, light issues and somewhat similar cold weather conditions in the winter. So I know the challenges that you go through, and I've been doing it a long time. So then you had the half of greenhouse, and then you expanded into the full one. Was that of January of this year or in the spring?
It was in September.
That you only expanded just this past September.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, everything happened in the last 3 months.
Oh wow. Okay, that's amazing. And describe a little bit about the interplanting techniques that you've been using too, going from sort of the winter to the summer crops.
Yeah. So I'm very lucky that the heat in my lease is actually included. So I have a heated greenhouse, both heated with propane. And I like to plant my hot crops, such as peppers and tomatoes, quite early into the year. So January 18th is about the date that I plant the tomatoes and the peppers. I grow bell peppers. And then usually in about 8 to 10 weeks, they're ready. So hopefully that's sometime around March. But when I'm planting them out into the greenhouse beds, there's often a lot of space in between the middle of the bed. And I do 2 rows on a 4 feet wide bed. So that's a bit different than a traditional 30-inch spacing, but I chose 4 feet rows in my greenhouse because the size and the width of the greenhouse was a bit uneven, and that made the most sense for me. So when I'm waiting for my tomatoes and peppers to get big enough to really soak up that soil, I plant one row of bok choy in the middle. And having bok choy in the middle is super great because I plant it as a transplant. So it's really only in the raised beds growing amongst the tomatoes and the peppers. So it's just about 3 or 4 weeks before it's ready to harvest as a baby bok choy. And by that time, the tomatoes and the peppers have fully bushed out and taken over the bed. So it's a perfect timing.
That's great. I love seeing the photos that you share of these techniques because everything looks incredibly lush and beautiful in the way that you have it organized. So it's really a breathtaking sight. So I'd love to learn a little bit more about the layout of the greenhouse. You have raised wood. Are they wood framed beds? And then what were those filled with for soil? How did you set that up?
So I got nothing really fancy, just untreated plywood. It was really important for me to get untreated, obviously because I didn't want anything leaching into the soil that shouldn't be. And I got some basic bulk soil that was triple mixed. So it has some compost, it has some topsoil and a few other things in it and amendments, and I just put that in the beds. That was the most economical decision for me because I had to get about 20 cubic yards. And that was really expensive to get here in Toronto. And then every month I amend with about 2 inches of compost. So I do 2 inches of vegetable compost that I also get in bulk. And I've been doing that since the beginning of my greenhouse.
And that sort of satisfied all of your fertility needs. Do you have to amend with, any soil amendments or any other fertilizers throughout the season?
Yeah, so if I'm growing in the winter time and I'm doing the compost method, I just fertilize with that. I think that's my fertilizer from the colder months. But when I'm growing the hot crops from March to October, I always want to make sure I'm doing supplemental. So I do the compost because I like to increase the soil biology. But then I also have a lot of different amendments I use. I make sure I use like a blooming fertility blend that I make, and I try to fertilize my tomatoes, my peppers usually once a month. I don't really front load my fertilizers because I find that since the soil is there in the compost, in the greenhouse, it makes the most sense to just scratch it in.
Do you have like a way that you're going to look at expanding outdoors into the outdoor land? Do you have a focus for what crops you're going to do out there now that you have that space?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm really excited about the outdoor land because I feel like it's much, much more lower maintenance than greenhouse farming. I'm probably going to be focusing mainly on my holy trinity, which is kale, collards, and chard. I jokingly say that because these are the crops that carry me through my farming career financially. I will be growing 4 rows of each. And after the 4 rows of kale, collards, and chard, I'm going to be installing 2 cat tunnels, so 2 caterpillar tunnels that are about 5 feet in height, with tomatoes in one that are determinate tomatoes. I'm going to be growing the BHN variety. And then in the second greenhouse, so in the second caterpillar tunnel, I'll be growing peppers. So normal sweet peppers I'll be growing in there. The variety I'll be growing is lipstick and glow from Johnny Seeds.
That's great. I love the holy trinity of kale, collards, and chard. That's a good combo. And I know how much you love growing collards because you're very open about that on social media. Tell me about collards. Why is that your favorite crop?
I think collards are my favorite crop because every time I've been farming anywhere, I've always seen collards. They're the one crop I've always seen, and I feel like no matter what I do, they still grow for me, and I really value that. In the heat of summer, I had some collards in my greenhouse in the side rows where the walls were a bit too short, that if I grew tomatoes, they would have bent too much. I grew some collards, and they survived in, I think it was 35 Celsius or 40 Celsius heat waves. So I think I just really love how resistant they are and also resilient. They just keep growing and growing, and they're just beautiful to look at, kind of like dinner plates, and I've always been mesmerized by just the way collards are.
And they taste so good too, especially in the winter. I find their flavor is so much sweeter and more delicious too. Mm-hmm. That's great. So I'd also love to hear a little bit more about, you're very open on social media about having a disability that affects your mobility. So how have you adapted your farming practices to meet your needs with that?
Yeah, so I have a pretty severe case of Meniere's disease, which is a disease that affects the eardrum in either one of the ears. So what that happens is that my speech is a bit impaired because I can't really hear it as much, and my mobility is impaired as well because it gives you vertigo and it inhibits your movements a lot. So for me, I've decided from the beginning that I would never grow a crop that was asking too much of me. Sure, tomatoes are very profitable, but I will never grow true greenhouses of tomatoes because that's just too much work. So I've usually sticked with a lot of salad greens because I find that it's easier to grow. And because kale, collards, and chard, those are my 3 favorite crops to grow because you kind of set it and forget it. And when I plant my kale, collards, and chard, I can plant it for 4 months. And then I usually replant it as well to get extra vigor throughout the season because I like to extend them very, very late into the season. So I just figured out what crops served me as a farmer with a disability and what crops did not serve me. So I know for some crops that are a bit too heavy, like I wanted to grow strawberries, but I realized that strawberries are a bit too intensive for me, ensuring that they can survive through the winter, putting down burlap sacks, giving them adequate fertilizers and nutrients. I just wasn't my thing. So just really ensuring that my crop plan is easygoing is what I'm doing, but I still plant high profit crops like tomatoes and cucumbers and peppers, but I just ensure that if I'm planting them, I'm not planting only high profitable crops.
So the salanova story, you just recently got into salanova, and you were just telling me earlier on that you've decided to discontinue salanova. So I'm curious about that story and how that worked out for you, how you sort of make those decisions.
Yeah, so I noticed that salanova in the wintertime started getting a bit of tip burn. So I noticed that two of my heads started getting tip burn. I didn't think anything of it. But then shortly after, a couple weeks, I noticed I started getting bottom end rot and some weird fungal diseases that were taking over my salanova. So I decided that compared to my kale that was thriving and surviving, not having any issues, not causing any problems, the salanova was just too much work for me. I also, like the many greenhouse growers, have an issue with aphids. And aphids really like the soft, tender leaves that salanova has compared to a kale. They much prefer a dinner of salanova. So I decided, probably yesterday or today, to not grow salanova anymore because I noticed that the amount of work it's taking me to clean the beds and ensure that there's adequate spacing, and make sure the dew is always dried from the leaves by noon was just far too much for what I was getting. So next winter, I won't be growing any salanova, any head lettuce, or any lettuce at all. I'll just be growing kale, collards, and chard. So far, you can tell the kind of farmer I am and what my two favorite crops are.
It's great. I mean, if you know what works for you and, you can make it work, as a business and as a farm, I think that's amazing. So, that's a great approach to really, decide what works for you and not necessarily feel like you are hampered down by, what you should be doing. So I think that's wonderful. Well, great. So, what would you say then are your biggest challenges with winter growing? Like what's made it the hardest for you so far?
Yeah, so the biggest challenge has never been daylight. As long as I time my crops accordingly, and I did a really good job this year with ensuring that my larger long-term crops are timed and planted out as seedlings the first week of October, and then my shorter-term crops are planted the second week of October. Daylight has never been an issue. I always expect to get a lower harvest in the winter. The biggest issue I've ever had is with aphids and white flies. So pests are so prevalent in my greenhouse and also my friends' winter greenhouses. And it's because the environment is warm and it's moist. And that environment is a breeding ground, I'm noticing, for these aphids. So that's a really big issue. I have a few tips that I've learned along the way, which have really, really helped, are to ensure my greenhouses are leaky. So I never close up my vents fully. I never put plastic on my vents to ensure that there's no cold air coming in. I actually keep my vents slightly open because having some dry air replace the warm, wet air is really beneficial to get the average humidity down. I try to get it down to 60% as much as I can, or 50% if I'm a lucky duck. But besides that, I also make sure that I'm not planting too close together. So in my first winter, I planted beds and beds of salad greens, and then I started getting all these aphids, and I was wondering, why am I getting these aphids? I'm having a really great time growing salad greens, and it's because they're so densely spaced, and the humidity was just too high in the greenhouse. So now I actually like to plant very far apart as much as I can to obviously create profitability, but having them far apart allows that airflow, and I want that airflow constantly happening in my greenhouse. And speaking about airflow, I have 4 fans that are always going on my greenhouse, and they are just normal fans inside. They're hooked up to the ceiling, and there's 2 fans on both sides, they're blowing in either direction. So there's nice cross breeze, and having that cross breeze helps you in stagnant air. And I think the last thing I would say is to always think ahead of the pet. So I actually bring in a lot of beneficial insects like ladybugs, lacewings, both green and brown, to eat those aphids and get them out of my greenhouse. And I always release these beneficial insects on a schedule. So I start in October because here in Toronto, that's when the heat is kind of going down, and I don't think ladybugs like extreme heat conditions that we can have in September. And then after I release my first batch, I release about, I would say 3,000 per greenhouse, and my greenhouses are about 2,000 square feet per each. So I release about that many every 3 weeks. Every 3 weeks I release them, and that way we can do a consistent supply, because a lot of these beneficial predators and insects, they have a shorter lifespan than I guess I initially assumed. So I always have to be constantly releasing them. But sometimes if I notice that they're laying a lot of eggs and I don't need to release them, I don't purchase them. But I always try to stay on top of that schedule.
Yeah, no, that's really important. Beneficial insects are huge, especially in any greenhouse management system. I always feel like it's like my birthday when I get the package of the ladybugs, and you open it up and they're all like, crawling. They've been cold, so they're a little, slow, and then they start crawling around and get all excited, and then you just sprinkling them like, you're salting your crops with them, this red salt. Hey, podcast listeners, we're going to pause for a moment to hear from one of our show sponsors, Johnny's Selected Seeds.
Hey there, this is Julie, one of the employee owners at Johnny's Selected Seeds. We're excited to support the Winter Growers podcast because this is where so much innovation and growth is happening right now. Since 1973, Johnny's has collaborated with innovative farmers and gardeners to offer seeds, tools, and information that will help growers be successful and feed their communities. Johnny's 40-acre research farm is at the heart of the company, and it's where we trial thousands of varieties and tools every year. Growers are always facing new challenges, from plant disease to changing markets, and our research team is dedicated to finding solutions. Please visit the Growers Library at the Johnny's website to find technical resources like the Winter Growing Guide, which has tips on how to plant and harvest into the shortest days of the year. You can also find variety comparison charts and extensive Jang roller trial results. All of us at Johnny's are working hard to make 2021 a great year, and we look forward to growing with you.
Now, back to the show. I've been, really inspired, following your story of the program you started, Growing in the Margins. And I'd love to learn more about that and how you started that, and, obviously how the pandemic has affected your ability to continue to do that right now too.
Yeah, so when I actually started Sundance Harvest, there was a prelude to Sundance Harvest, and that was Growing in the Margins. And Growing in the Margins is a totally free program for youth 18 to 25 who are marginalized within the food system. So the demographics are largely BIPOC, but also BIPOC youth that have disabilities like myself, are queer, trans, two-spirit, non-binary, and other youth who face a myriad of marginalizations in the food system. So I started Growing the Margins actually right before Sundance Harvest. I had access to land in Trinity Bellwood's neighborhood of Toronto behind a really cool progressive church, and they wanted to do some food justice work, and they offered me the land to grow a small little garden just to convene and teach some youth some practical skills about growing food. So I started Growing the Margins there, and I didn't even think that Sundance Harvest would actually happen. And then many of the youth who took that program kept urging me to start a farm. They wanted to see a farm that was reflective of all the values that I really instilled within Growing in the Margins, which is food sovereignty, which is community building, but also equity in agriculture. So I started listening to them because they were all my friends around my age, and I started Sundance Harvest. And Growing in the Margins, I would say, is the soul and the heart of Sundance Harvest. I love the vegetables I grow, and I love being a farmer, but more than anything, I love being an educator, and I love growing farmers. If you were to say, do you like growing vegetables or farmers more, I would probably say farmers. The joy it brings me knowing that the participants of Growing in the Margins, the majority of them end up starting their own farms or working within agriculture, is such a great thing to know. The first cohort, the very, very first cohort in early 2019, had a lot of youth that actually now work in Toronto's urban ag scene. One of the youth, Echo Stone, they manage a 2-acre farm in Etobicoke in the neighborhood I grew up with an organization called Food Share. Another youth, Adjua works at Parkdale Green Thumb Enterprises, and she helps run a really amazing rooftop farm. And I feel really inspired and honored to be able to teach youth these crucial skills about how to run a farm. My first year with Growing in the Margins really wasn't that structured. It was primarily drop-in. I just taught whatever they wanted to know. So that's why this fall that just passed, this past September, I really wanted to hone in and create a proper curriculum. So now Growing in the Margins is a structured 12-week program that includes field trips, business planning, and hands-on farm skill training at my farm in Downsview Park. And I take on about 16 to 20 youth per season, and that's divided into 2 separate classes. And youth learn things from composting to having field trips at a community farm and learning about orchard training and orchard growing. Another workshop they would probably learn about is harvesting techniques. This is something that's often overlooked, and I try to teach as well. So this past fall cohort just ended, and a lot of the youth now are gearing up to start their new farm in spring. One of the youth, Aaliyah Fraser, is starting a really beautiful 1/4 of an acre farm in Erin, Ontario. Another youth, Hermela, wants to start a microgreen business that I will be supporting by buying her microgreens. And there's so many other ones that I don't probably have time to name that are starting radical and new urban ag businesses. And I feel, again, very humbled to be an educator and a teacher to ensure that the next generation of farmers are centering equity and also are representative of who wants to be farmers. Largely BIPOC femmes take my class, and I think it's such an amazing thing that I'm seeing all this talent and all this innovation, and that these youth simply need a place to learn. And there's a really big void of that here in Ontario. There's no farm training programs that have centered equity and justice. So there's really nowhere for these youth to learn those skills to become future farmers.
I love that. It's such an inspiring story, Cheyenne. And it's just so amazing to think of how many people you are inspiring through this work. And that just spreads out, like wildfire all around you. And, it pays you back. It pays the community back. I mean, it's just incredible to see the effects of the work that you're doing. And you say it's humbly, but it's really amazing. So I guess what I wonder about is, if people want to support what you're doing, how can they support that work?
Yeah, so right now, Growing the Margins is in the process of becoming its own separate nonprofit. Because of how fast Sundance Harvest grew, I didn't have the hindsight to do that earlier, which I wish I did. But if you want to support Sundance Harvest, on my website, at the very bottom of it, there's a donation button, and I appreciate all donations. The donations go directly to Growing in the Margins so I can expand, and for the 12 weeks, actually, about half of the time in the spring and summer, there's field trips. So the youth aren't just taught by me, but they're taught by amazing other and radical urban agriculture experts here in Toronto. One of my friends, Adam Dirks, who works alongside Echo from Growing the Margins, is a composting wizard. So, for example, those donations would help me pay Adam to teach a class for Growing the Margins in the spring 2021. But donations are always happily accepted.
That's so great. So I guess, with all this that you're doing, you're obviously a very busy person. And I wonder, how do you take time off? How do you recharge? How do you, rest and balance all of this work with your life?
Yeah, so I think the biggest thing I do is I'm trying to have no tech time. So when I go home, usually around 8 p.m., I try to turn off my phone, turn off everything, and usually read a book or take a walk with some friends and just relax. I think really getting that tech out of my life at nighttime helps me a lot, considering that Instagram is a really big part of my farm. My 26,000 followers are very nice, but I kind of don't want to always be plugged in. And the thing I also like about farming is oftentimes I can't be on my phone. If I'm harvesting a whole bed of beets, I can't be texting on my phone. I have to put that on the sidelines. And that allows me time to think and really meditate over topics and feelings and thoughts that I otherwise couldn't if I was always in tech.
So what about taking because you're farming year round, do you have specific times that you're able to take off? Because obviously farming year round doesn't allow for much, off time, so to speak.
Yeah. So I made the decision a week ago to take off 3 weeks. So tomorrow evening is my start of my 3 weeks off. So I'll have 3 weeks off. I'm going to go to a cabin in the woods. I'm going to eat lots of great snacks and have a great time going tobogganing. And I'll eventually head back to my farm mid-January.
That's great. And how did you get into tobogganing? I'd love to hear about that.
Yeah, I just like the idea of having fun in the winter despite how cold it is. I feel like a big thing I have with the winter is I want to hibernate. But I'm learning as I get older to enjoy the natural change of the seasons, but just wear warmer clothes and have fun in the winter. And tobogganing is me having fun in the outdoors and pushing myself to do that.
Do you have, and what's like the favorite spot you go to? Do you have like a favorite hill, or where do you go?
Oh, I don't have any favorite hills. I love exploring new hills. That's my thing.
Oh, that's great. So let's see, just, shifting back to the work you're doing, do you have any employees? Do you hire anyone? What's your, or is this totally solo?
Yeah. So before COVID started, I was actually in the process and I had the paperwork to hire someone. Then COVID started and I got really anxious because the farmers markets here in Toronto closed. They weren't considered an essential service, which is very silly. And because it was a farmers market farm, I didn't know how to pivot and I didn't know how to change my sales methods to ensure that I could stay afloat. So I paused on hiring until I made sure that my farm could really survive the pandemic, because I had to pay a really, really high lease here in Toronto, thousands of dollars a month. And I wanted to have a stable farm before I hired anyone on. So now I can confidently say that I'm at a point where I can hire someone and ensure that they have stability, they have enough hours, and that also my protocols and safety is in place. So I'm looking to hire someone in January, and I will also be hiring more seasonal staff throughout the warmer season.
That's great. And then, that allows you to, I'm sure, expand into more markets. And with your expansion of, another greenhouse and 10,000 square feet of outdoor land, that definitely is going to require more help, I'm sure.
Yeah, and I've always made the effort to say that Sundance Harvest never accepts volunteers. There's a lot of great reports and work being done across Canada regarding unpaid internships, and I've never felt right accepting any unpaid work, because I know that the people who often can do that work aren't those who are underrepresented in agriculture. Many of the youth who take Growing the Margins tell me that they don't feel confident or comfortable to do unpaid internships because they have a dependent or like a child, or they have student loan debt, or they don't have family intergenerational wealth that they can borrow for 6 months working unpaid. So I really have made the effort to actually just hire staff outright instead of doing any type of unpaid internship, because I want to at least allow the youth from Growing the Margins to be able to work within Sundance Harvest and have that community, and not have a barrier of having to take out a loan for 6 months to survive and pay their bills or something like that.
Yeah, no, it's really important that you're addressing those issues, because obviously within farming, at least the model that a lot of the small scale farmers have followed is sort of the internship, unpaid or volunteer work. And while it's been difficult for, the farm owner to figure out how to make that work financially if the margins are so low, it's also important that people working and learning are paid fairly, paid a fair wage. So I'm glad that you are addressing this. I think it's really important that more and more farmers speak up to these issues. So thank you for doing that.
Yeah.
Well, I guess along those lines too, I'd love to learn, just obviously you're doing so much already, but what else needs to happen to help transform, small scale agriculture, sustainable agriculture, no-till, whatever you want to call it, to become more BIPOC centered and led? What's your vision for that?
That's a great question. The biggest thing I would say is resources. So many of the youth, and I usually ask and I get to know them over the 12 weeks really deeply, don't have access to intergenerational wealth. They don't have access to land. And some of the youth aren't settlers and have dealt with colonization. So I would say the biggest thing is access to resources, whether that be land to grow on, so land to purchase, land to lease, land to rent, and or capital to start up their farm. There's not a lot of opportunities here in, obviously, Toronto to get large swaths of land. I'm very lucky that I was at the right time, in the right place, and the right stubbornness to get what I wanted at Downsview Park. But looking outwards in more of a rural sense, there is a few farmers I know personally who are doing some work to ensure that there are some more representation in agriculture by ensuring that BIPOC youth are centered with land leases. There's a farm in Erin, Ontario that Aaliyah Fraser, my previous Growing the Margin student, is actually leasing from. And this farm outwardly said that they would like to lease their own land to BIPOC youth. They would like to prioritize BIPOC youth, and they would like to show them that this is a place where there's equity centered and they can feel supported. And Aaliyah, seeing that, was like, wow, that's so great to actually see it. And I feel like if any folks are listening to this right now and thinking, well, how can my farm help the future of more equity in agriculture, is simply verbally saying that people are welcome. Creating relationships and affirming is such a beautiful thing to do. And it could be as simple as saying, I understand that there's a lack of diversity in agriculture, so I'd like to offer this affordable lease, this affordable 2-year, 3-year lease to BIPOC youth who are interested in agriculture or just BIPOC people. So that's what I would say. And then the second thing is resources in terms of also education. Growing the Margins is the only program of its kind, as far as I know, in Canada. The only program that actively centers youth who are of color and youth who experience marginalization, but gets them started for their farm. So I don't just teach them, how to make compost and raise beds. I'm teaching them how to business plan and how to start a business that is profitable, that can make it into their career. And I'm really, really proud that I do that piece too, because when I started Sundance Harvest, I probably would have not made any of the mistakes, or maybe not all of the mistakes I did, if I had someone like me who could mentor, who could teach, who could be there. So I really want to have Growing the Margins continue and hopefully maybe expand even across Canada when it has not-profit status to do that. So I would say those are the things I'm thinking about, is more access to land, access to capital, and then access to really good representative education.
Yeah, no, more people like you, Cheyenne, all over Canada, right? And the U.S. I was just thinking it would be, if we could find a way to clone you. And so you bring up the business component. How did you learn that? And how, I guess, obviously it's such an important component, but it is so rarely taught from the beginning in a farming career. So how did you get into that, and how have you learned along the way?
Yeah, I could say so I was never one to be good at school. I actually skipped a lot of my classes because I never found that what I was being taught in high school was applicable to my real life. So when I wanted to get into farming, I knew that I needed to learn how to make it a living. From hearing a few friends talk about farming, I always heard about how grueling it is and how low the margins are, the profit margins. And I didn't want it to be hard, and I wanted to be able to have an easier time than most people I knew were. So the first thing I did before I actually learned to farm in a full way was read a lot of business books. And as someone who isn't really that down for capitalism, I did take parts and bits from business books, and I added my own flair to it. So I learned about demand in the market. I also learned about filling a void. When I started Sundance Harvest, I walked around a lot of farmers markets and I saw what farmers were growing and what they weren't growing. And in the winter, I saw almost every single farmer in the farmers markets were selling garlic and beets and onions and carrots, but none of them were selling fresh greens. So I was thinking, wait, why don't I just start a farm that grew a lot of greens in winter? And that's why I've really been honing in my winter growing skills, because there's such a lack of winter greens and any type of tasty salad greens here in Toronto in the cold season. So things like that, things I simply walk around and observing. I've also taken the conscious effort from reading a few business books to not compete. I try not to compete with other farmers. If I see another farmer growing something, sure, I could try really hard to grow it a lot better and lower my prices and dial in that efficiency. But instead, I just try to grow a different crop, because I understand with my limitations, with my disability, the best thing for me to do is just take it a bit easy so I can retire much later and not much earlier. So I would say reading a lot of business books is great, but also understanding that you don't have to read business farm books. You can read business books that aren't related to farming and just take bits and pieces that work with you.
That's great. And so all of this is what you're sharing with the Growing in the Margins students, and you have sort of like a template that you share with them, or how does that work?
Yeah, so they have a designated class, but I actually have a big whiteboard, and I ask them directly, what do you want to learn? So that's the class that's my fun class, because I ask them, what thing in business are you stuck on? Or what thing are you worried about with having a farm? And then for the first hour or so, I directly answer their questions, because I found that for classes like that related to more like theory and like less hands-on, it's best that I just ask them what they want to know, because I could be teaching them for something for an hour and they'd have no interest in it. But they're so much more engaged when I directly let them have a stake in their learning process. So I do that. And then the last hour, I usually talk about how I figure out my prices, how you price for labor, and a bunch of other things like marketing and social media as well. So I try to incorporate a lot of them, but I always tell them to figure out a way to pay themselves a living wage. And if that means to not grow potatoes, then that means to not grow potatoes. But I always center the point that they should still be paid a fair wage if they're farming, and they really shouldn't settle for less. So figuring out ways to maybe, dial up their efficiency or transition crops out of their crop plan to ensure that they're still paid fairly.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense, and is so practical, and I'm sure incredibly helpful from that, hands-on perspective. So, and one crop we haven't actually talked about are mushrooms. So is that something that you have decided is here to stay, or is that also something you're on the fence about?
Yeah, so compared to all my other crops, even salanova, mushrooms are the biggest princess of the lot. They are so hard to grow. They need such sterile conditions, and because I have a greenhouse filled with soil, there's a lot of non-sterile conditions there. And I'm on the fence about them. There's such a big market in Toronto for like urban grow mushrooms, I'm noticing. When I made the announcement that I was going to start doing it, I got well over 20 DMs about how do I purchase the mushrooms. But I think I'm going to figure that out later on. Right now I have a sort of MacGyver set up in my greenhouse to have a fruiting chamber to grow oyster mushrooms, but it's not working out the best way I want it to work out. So I'm deciding that, growing mushrooms in my greenhouse only really works in the winter, in spring, and a part of the fall. But in the fall in Toronto, we get such a hot fall. So maybe I should get a separate facility to actually grow the mushrooms in, that I can air condition and have it be indoors. So I'm still on the fence about mushrooms, but I have a lot of interest.
That's great. And what about the microgreens? How does that look for you?
Yeah, my microgreens are really amazing. There's not a big market here in Toronto for individual microgreen mixes, so like a salad mix or a spicy mix. However, I noticed the best way that they're profitable for me, and I feel like this is the best tip I can give anyone, is to actually work them into my salad mix. As a winter grower, as most of us know, things take a really long time to grow compared to the summer, but microgreens are such a quick crop. A crop of pea shoots can take about 10 to 14 days to be mature and ready to cut. Compare that to how long a salanova takes to regrow after you cut it in the dead of winter. It's kind of about the same, for me at least. So when I grow my salad mix, I usually do about 70% salanova and about 30% pea shoots. So I actually can stretch my salad mix much, much longer, and I can get a lot more bags out of it from doing it that way. So I add pea shoots to my salad mix, and it really adds a nice bulk. And also, it's very interesting, and it's a cool texture. A lot of my customers say that they love the pea shoots in the salad mix because it's a nice earthy and crunchy taste that maybe the salanova doesn't actually provide for them.
The yum. You're making me hungry talking about so I guess, this has been since September 2019, and, just over a year later, how much you've done, it's incredible. So I guess what I'd like to know is, what's your 5-year plan? What's it going to look like 5 years from now?
Yeah, I guess in 5 years I'll be 28. I'll be 28. What I would say my 5-year plan would be, right now I'm waiting to hear if I get 2 acres on a 49-year lease for very cheap. So I want to get those 2 acres, and it's right outside of Toronto, like 45 minutes outside of Toronto. And ideally what I'd like to do is start a rural incubator farm for growing in the margins participants, because I know I'm providing education, but I would also like to provide land, because I know that's one of the biggest barriers next to education and community for BIPOC youth to get into agriculture. So I'd love to start up a rural incubator farm where I can parcel off 1/4 of an acre to each youth, and they can start their own farms and maybe do that for 2 years and then move on to a bigger and better site. That's what I really want to do, and I'm more so honing into that. I really like my role as an educator, but of course I still want to farm. So I'm probably going to end up staying at the Downsview farm site as much as I can, because I'm noticing urban farming is much more profitable than rural farming has been in the past for me. And I think it's simply because it's a niche, and I feel fine saying that it's a niche. A lot of people are very interested when they come to my farm, and they're willing to pay $1 more for really any item. So I think I'll always probably stay as an urban farm, but I would like to have a rural operation going as well. So that's what I imagine. Maybe in 5 years I'll be living in the country and I'll have someone running my city farm, but who knows?
Yeah, no, anything is possible. It's so great to see what you've done so far. And I hope to, 5 years from now, be able to visit your incubator farm and see how many farmers you've inspired and helped to lead the way. So thank you for everything you're doing. It's really wonderful. So I think it's time to launch into our lightning round of questions. Are you ready to get started on those?
Yes, I am ready.
Okay. And, lightning round is sort of just the term. You can expand on some of these answers too, because I think a lot of people like to hear that. So, okay. So first one, your favorite crop to grow, cook, or eat?
Oof, kale. I love to grow purple kale. My favorite type of kale is red boar kale.
Yum. And how do you like to cook it?
I like to have it in a salad, a nice Caesar salad. I like to massage the kale until it's like super, super soft, and then have way too much garlic and a lovely heavy dressing.
Yum. Okay, next. What's the hardest part of farming?
The hardest part of farming, I would say, is to have to roll with the punches. I can make a crop plan and assume that I'm going to have everything perfectly the way I want, and I'm going to get X, Y, Z amount of harvest, and then I could have aphids, or I can have a drought, or I can have a bunch of different issues. So rolling with the punches has probably been the hardest part for me.
Yeah, no, there's not a lot to farming that you can control, sadly. Okay, favorite music you listen to while farming?
I listen to a lot of the White Stripes. I feel like a lot of high energy music. That being said, I do love some Simon and Garfunkel on some cloudy days.
And what do you love besides farming?
I love throwing dinner parties. Before COVID, I would throw about weekly dinner parties with friends that turned into dance parties at the end of it. I really miss doing that and getting to play fun board games, but also just getting to meet and chat with my friends in person.
One piece of advice you wish you had starting out, or something you wish you'd done differently?
Something I wish I'd done differently was to probably focus more on longer-term crops that can provide high yield. So like I said, any bunching greens, I wish I did that differently because compared to baby greens or any type of salad green, it's way less work, in my opinion. You don't have to wash it in the way of having a bubbler and having a drying rack. And overall, I'm noticing that bunching greens like kale, collards, and chard, or even arugula and mustard, they have a lot less need. There's a lot less labor, there's a lot less weeding I'm noticing if I have a landscape fabric down. So I think investing in longer season crops is something that I probably would have done earlier on.
What is your learning edge, and where do you feel like your abilities or understanding as a farmer could grow?
My learning edge, so the thing I'm good about learning, I would say, is I'm good about being nimble. At the very beginning, I would be really down on myself if my crop plan didn't work or if there was another cog in the machine of my farm not going the way I wanted to. But now I'm very proud. This past summer, I'm very, very nimble. I didn't have a lower and lean system in my greenhouse when I was growing tomatoes, so I figured out a system with creating a cross-wire MacGyver line, kind of like a clothesline in my greenhouse, and having all my tomatoes run on that. So I feel like I'm getting more nimble as I go along, and something that I wish I could improve on probably would be more organizational skills. I have horrible organizational skills. Excel spreadsheets are my worst nightmare, so I actually write everything down, which is not the best probably for my accountant. So I think being better at organization skills and also figuring out how to have my invoices all in one place.
I'm surprised to hear that because, you've got to be somewhat organized to do what you've done so far, Cheyenne. So you got to have some organization there, ability there. Even if you don't see it, it sounds like you've got something right. How do you relate to that which is out of your control?
I try to change it to be as much as in my control as I can. So with my disability, I realize that some crops are just too much labor for me to devote. So that's when I cycle them out. Like when I'm cycling out salanova for winter production, I cycle it out because I know that if I do an easier crop, I'll have an easier time and therefore more control.
What do you long for, and how does that influence how you farm?
What I long for would be to have a full closed-loop incubator farm, and I think that's really what I'm moving toward. I love that I can offer that piece of education, and I think that's really tied into food justice, that I can allow people to, have education to start their own projects to build up their communities. But I really long for more of a closed-loop system where I can provide the education, and then I can provide the land as well for them just to get started. So that's what I long for, yeah.
What do you feel is your gift to give on behalf of people and the land?
I think it's just honestly to create more farmers. I would say also to grow really good food and to grow with ecological growing practices in mind. But I think if I can grow more farmers, then that can even do more work to grow amazing food and to care for the land, because then tens and tens of people will be doing it, similar to me. Yes,
hear, hear. And lastly, how will you grow old farming?
I will grow old farming probably having a house in the country that isn't at all related to farming. I've always dreamed to have a house in the country that I don't farm at, that I can separate work from my personal life and just maybe have, a few blueberry bushes here and there, maybe an apple tree, but that's all. And then I would commute to my farm. That's what I want to do. And I still want to farm probably for the rest of my life, but I'm really excited to find that work-life balance.
Yeah, no, that's a never-ending question, right? Well, my dad just turned 82 yesterday, and he's still going. So, he spends a little more time on his tractor probably than he used to. But, it's great that he can still be so actively involved in his 80s.
Happy birthday to your dad.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much, Cheyenne. This has been such a pleasure to talk with you, to learn. I feel like I become more and more inspired, the more I learn about the work you're doing and how much you're educating new farmers. So I really, really am glad that we get to have this conversation, and I'm so happy that more people will be able to learn about your work. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It was really nice to speak to you and also to speak about the work I've been doing.
Today's show was produced by me, Clara Coleman, with support from No-Till Growers. Special thank you to Willie Breeding for the theme music. Thank you to the patrons at patreon.com/no-till-growers for helping to make this show possible. Thank you all for listening, and we'll see you next week.